Episode 131, Apostate, Phil from Flawed Theology. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I'm in conversation with Phil from the Flawed Theology podcast. Phil is a fellow contributor of the Apostate book that is now available and tells the stories of 21 people who have left Christianity. Links in the show notes for the book and Phil's podcast content. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is Matthew. You're probably familiar with my voice now. If you don't know who I am or what my name is, why have you not listened to my entire back catalogue? And I have with me somebody who's also a podcaster, somebody who I've actually wanted to have a conversation with for quite some time. Despite being an American, he has a fabulous listening voice. Welcome, Phil. Where are you from, Phil, and what do you do?
Oh, hey, everybody. This is Phil Quagliarello. I am the co-host of the Flawed Theology podcast here across the pond. I'm in Virginia on the East Coast of the States. And I'm happy to be here. I've been wanting to talk to you, too. So it's kind of a fun coming together that we're able to pull off today. So I'm excited about it.
Excellent. Virtual high fives to that. Yeah. I do enjoy your podcast, Phil. And I mean that genuinely. I like the way that you and your co-host talk about elements of Christianity in a very calm and rational way. And for anybody who's listened to any of the solo shows that I do, I am extraordinarily spiky about elements of Christianity. I tend to get very, very sweary, and I tend to engage sarcasm probably to elements that some people will consider unhelpful. You managed to avoid all of that, yet still managed to put a really focused laser on some of the shitty parts of Christianity. How do you manage it so nicely?
Well, that's funny because if I thought about how I do the podcast, I feel like I'm pretty sweary and I get fairly animated. It's kind of funny because I do the podcast, from my basement, and a lot of times my wife and kids are upstairs, and then I'll come upstairs and my wife will be like, "Man, you swore a lot during that one." And I'm like, did I? Because I kind of don't notice it. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of aspects of Christianity that really, for lack of a better term, just piss me off, and so I think it's important at some point to kind of show people that it's okay to be angry, but then also bring it back to, there's also a limit to the anger that is beneficial. So I think Susie's actually better at kind of tempering the emotions, I think, than I am, because she kind of brings things back to the rational level, and I sometimes go off on the emotional tangents because we have two very different stories too. So that might be the biggest thing that helps keep it feeling even keel is my co-host is a good balance, so.
Yeah, it's often good to have a co-host. I miss Andrew when he isn't available to do a show with me. For those who haven't listened or haven't heard, Andrew is very busy setting up his own business, and we do try to do a show together, but he's not always available. So when he's not available, I just run ahead and go and do my own stuff. But right. I do find that when Andrew's around, we do tend to temper each other and things do get a little bit calmer. I do prefer it that way. So in terms of podcasting then, and in terms of getting this book, now I know why you wanted to get involved with this book, because it's very probably the same reason. Actually, this book, I'm talking as though everybody knows. We got involved in a book. This is about the third or the fourth episode that I've done regarding the book. We're recording this on the 5th of January, the day before the book Apostate, Voices of Deconversion is going out officially on Amazon, although it is or has been available on pre-order. Later this afternoon, or probably around about now while we're talking, my very first interview about that book, which is with Sarah, who is the lovely Sarah who's arranged this book, who's got all of this band of authors together and has found a publisher and has done the audio for the book and has put a lot of effort into it on behalf of the 21 people who are involved in it. So that interview is going live this afternoon while we're talking. But listeners, this is several months later, or a couple of months later, rather. So I hope you've already bought the book, read the book, listened to the other 4 interviews that are ahead of this one. But Phil, so we are involved in various Facebook groups and support groups around deconversion and talking about that. We've known of each other's presence for some time, even if we haven't spoken properly together.
Yeah.
So I think I can guess why you jumped on board with this book as soon as Sarah asked about it, was because you have a story to tell. You're familiar with telling your story, and you wanted to be there and be somebody who tells other people that it's safe to tell our story of deconversion. That's why I got involved with that. But you've been a podcaster for a couple of years beforehand. So fill those gaps in for us. How did you get involved in podcasting? Why would you want to put your story out and expose yourself to the kind of criticism you know that Christians are going to aim at you for daring to tell your story?
Yeah, they're kind of related, I think. I mean, I've been doing the podcast now for, I think we're finishing up our third season, so
Right.
We've covered the span of about 3 years and some change. The release schedule has been varied. We're almost into the 4th year of doing the podcast. At some point during that podcast journey, I decided to start a blog too, and I had written out my story anyway, which the reason for writing the story out initially was actually to kind of help to coalesce the story itself, because for most of us, and I'm sure yours is the same, and a lot of the stories that are in the book, it's a very gradual progression. A lot of people asking, well, what made you deconvert? And I've never met a person yet that says, well, it was this one thing and I was off. It's a gradual, a death by 1,000 cuts type of thing. So I had written my story out in kind of a much longer form for my blog, kind of to get my head around the story, because it's a little bit of a process to go from being, in my case, an evangelical fundamentalist Christian Baptist, to, an agnostic, atheist, rationalist type person. So I wrote my story out, and I had also come up with the podcast idea just because I had heard several podcasts, including yours was one of them that I had come across several years ago, along with Born Again and Exvangelical and some other things. And the thing that always grabbed me, Graceful Atheist was another one that was filled with people's stories. And so I was like, I really like that format of those podcasts, because stories tell, you can't argue with someone's stories. You can't argue with someone's experience and say, well, that experience isn't valid. So that was a big part of even getting to the point of deconverting for me, was understanding that other people had been through it. But I came up with the idea for our podcast was more about the idea of dissecting aspects of Christian theology and then pointing out the logical flaws in them. As someone that kind of was an apologist as a Christian, I prided myself, I thought at the time, at having a sound logical basis for my faith. Even though everything was based on faith, I was really into what I considered evidentiary support for what I believed. And I was into a lot of different apologists, and one in particular who most people probably have never heard of. His name is Phil Nelson. I met him at a college retreat. I was a campus minister at a college, and we did a retreat, and he had workshops that were all about apologetics. And so I got really hooked on this apologetic thing. Even later, as a Christian, I was always looking for more data, to support my faith, because I hadn't really had doubts per se, but I was always looking for ways to evangelize, to tell people, and not just say, hey, just believe it because it feels good or because it sounds good, but here's the sound reasons of why you should believe. So when I started deconstructing and eventually deconverting, I realized that a lot of those rationale that I had was completely flawed, and so that's kind of where the name of the podcast, Flawed Theology, came from, because I was like, there's a lot of problems with theology in general. And we focus mostly on, kind of traditional Christianity, because both Susie and I come from an American Christianity version, her being Lutheran, and I was Baptist, for the majority of my life, and took a few turns to other denominations and stuff. That's kind of how the podcast came to be. And then the book came to be because I was already telling the story anyway. And I thought I wanted to write my own book too, but I never really had the discipline or the resources or the time to kind of do that whole thing. So when Sarah posted in one of the groups that she was putting together a book, I was like, this is my chance to, put it down. And I tweaked the story a bit from the blog, and Sarah was really amazing with that editing process. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it all came to be. So I've really enjoyed reading all the other stories. I know my own story, but the thing that really jumps out at me in the book is all these stories, no matter how different they are, they all have a common thread that runs between all the stories. And I find that fascinating. So I think people will find that fascinating when they read it as well.
Yes, that's right. Because there's only there's only a limited number of ways which you can say Christianity no longer worked for me.
Right. Yeah, it gets a little repetitive where you're like, well, I just don't believe it anymore. Well, okay, that's not going to make for one, it's not very interesting to people. And for two, it also gets, you get in this mode of like, well, do I have to defend why I don't believe anymore? And I personally think that you don't have to, but I think it's good to be able to, because there are people that are somewhat, they may actually ask in good faith, trying to understand how you went from being a full-fledged believer, and in your case, like a missionary kid, and I was a pastor's kid and all that kind of stuff, to going what most people would view as the whole other extreme of not believing in any deity or deities of any kind.
Yeah.
It's seemingly a very big jump. Looking at it now, to me, it's not that big of a jump. I always like to say, if you're an atheist, a full-on atheist, you only believe in one less God,
yes,
than the other people. Like everyone else is an atheist about every other God. I just added one more, and that just happens to be the God that most people believe in. So,
yes, quite. All you're doing is you're applying the same critical logic to every other God to one more God.
Right. Yeah. I did the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, quite. What you've done is you've unlocked the blockage that was stopping you from applying that same level of criticality to your preferred pet belief. You go, oh, really? Okay. Maybe it doesn't make sense after all.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when you're a Christian, of any kind, you basically look at other religions and even versions of Christianity, and you have like pretty specific ways that you can debunk those versions of Christianity, if it's, or other religions, if it's Islam, if it's, in my case, like we even viewed Catholics as non-Christians, here's why Catholics aren't Christians, or here's why Muslims aren't Christians, or here's why Buddhists aren't Christians, or here's why whoever, pick your flavor, why they're not a Christian. But then when you come up against something that breaks that cognitive dissonance that you have about your own version, then it's like, it's a real big, oh shit moment, because you're like, oh man, I've been doing the same thing that they're doing, just with a different focus. And that can be disconcerting. It'd be painful, for some people as well.
Yes. And I think for me, that worst moment of cognitive dissonance came when I was trying to educate myself so that I could better challenge evolution, because I tell it a little bit in my own story in the book, and I've told it in blog form, and I've told it on other podcasts before, about a moment I had trying to defend creationism, and basically got my butt handed to me by people who are better at arguing evolution. And that was an extremely humiliating and embarrassing experience. So I thought, okay, I'm going to learn more about evolution. And I studied more about evolution, and I realized that huge swathes of this not only make sense, but I've got vast amounts of data to support it. And the process of leading up to the conclusion of evolution isn't just a God rejection, as some Christians like to say, or the work of the devil, as other Christians like to say. There is actually genuine, hard, empirically demonstrable scientific data that goes behind it. And that realization for me, and I think for me, it was probably the age of humans and the presence of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and all those other subhuman is probably not the right word to use, but there's other proto-human species that existed alongside modern humans, and realizing that there was intermating between them all and the different paths that they went on, and coming to appreciate that. And the cognitive dissonance that I felt in that, and the way that conflicted my desire to believe the Genesis narrative, was really, really difficult. And it was like your brain stalling. It really was a very strange experience. And it took me some while to work through that and get over that. And I think it wasn't until I was actually able to acknowledge that it really was cognitive dissonance that I was going through, and to be able to put a name to that experience. And I think it was actually that realization that helped me to break through that wall, and to actually go, you know what, it is okay to accept this as true. Deal with the fallout afterwards, But here in this moment, it's okay to accept that is true because that is the indication. Now deal with the fallout.
Right. And like we've said, the term cognitive dissonance a couple times. And honestly, I had never heard that term at all. And I was a psychology major, a clinical psychology major, granted at a Christian university, so I feel like I had heard the term cognitive dissonance in some, academic realm or arena, but I had never heard it in relation to faith or belief. And I think I want to say it was on the Born Again podcast. One of the co-hosts said something about cognitive dissonance and then explained what it was. And I was like, oh, shit. Like that's exactly that's exactly what I have going on with my belief system. And that podcast was huge for me, which actually a friend of mine told me about, because I had been having all this, I wouldn't say like doubt per se, but it was just like a lot of things within my very active Christian life that I couldn't quite reconcile. I couldn't quite come to terms with. And when I started listening to that podcast, I was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm going through. And I got some real kind of comfort from that because there were aspects of Christian. I went through kind of a progression in my own faith. And I tell a little bit about this in the story, but because of brevity and being in a book with 21 other authors, I couldn't tell the whole story. But I started out like very rigid evangelical fundamentalist, and then I moved to a denomination here in the U.S. called Calvary Chapel, which I think I don't know if that's big across the pond there. And I thought it was kind of a more progressive. I'm putting this in quotes for the listeners, progressive, because their music was a lot more progressive, but it turns out their theology was actually just as conservative, or if not more, than the fundamentalist Baptist that I had come from. But it taught me some things. It was very exegetical in the Bible, but it was also opened up the idea of letting your faith have emotion, because that's not really allowed in the Baptist tradition. And I was in that for like 8 to 10 years, and then I landed back in a Baptist church that was kind of a little bit more progressive, again, on its face. And then I landed in the Methodist tradition, which is actually quite progressive. And I landed there because I kept having these experiences in churches where something didn't quite click, where I was like, I don't feel like this is what Christianity is about. And it usually revolved around like social justice issues, or the idea of like turning someone's faith discovery into like a program. Churches are notorious for taking someone's experience and then trying to monetize it. Like I don't know if you're familiar with the book The Purpose Driven Life.
Yep.
So that was a huge thing, like, for a very long time, and I hated it because I was like, everyone and their brother is preaching about the purpose-driven life and blah, 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 blah. And I refused to read the book. And like, I hated it because I was like, oh, it's a program. You're trying to turn God into a program. And the similar thing happened at my second to last church with a kind of a more progressive faith journey that people had been on. And the church I was going to tried to turn it into a program. And I was like, oh, it just pissed me off. Right. So I landed in this other church, and it was very progressive, like, to the point of they had a female pastor, which I had never experienced before and used to think was a sin. They had gay people in the church, and they were accepted and loved as human beings, and they were all phenomenal people. And I was like, wait, that doesn't jive right with what I've been told. I thought gays are all going to hell, and here were some of the most dedicated and committed people I'd ever met, and they just happened to love someone of the same sex. Like, who cares? And so I was in this shifting, that probably lasted, 10 or 15 years, and didn't really realize it was happening. And then the thing that kind of got me out of it was all the motivation about doing good, like this church that I was in was doing. I realized, well, why do I need God to motivate me to do these things? Like, I was very into a organization called Love 146 that works against human trafficking. And I started educating myself about human trafficking and all that stuff, and raised a bunch of money and held fundraisers. And I was like really into that. Right. And global hunger was another thing I was involved in working against. And I realized I don't need I shouldn't need a deity to motivate me to do this. I shouldn't have to do this because of what I believe. I should be doing this because it's the right thing to do. And then that kind of was the slippery slope, as they say, that led me to the point of like, well, if I don't need God to do these things, well, then I started digging into, well, how much of this is actually true? And the more I dug, the more I found things that they just didn't make sense. And creation evolution was a big problem for me because I was a staunch, young earth 6-day creationist. That's what they teach you in the Baptist church. And that's what I was taught my whole life. Evolution was always like almost immediately dismissed without even giving any evidence for it. It was just like, well, the Bible doesn't support it, and so there's no way it's true. So when I started learning about the science behind it too, I was like, oh, this actually makes a lot more sense. But that programming was so embedded in my head that I was like, wait, but how? But wait, how? And there was always an answer to that, but wait, how? Which I thought was really fascinating.
If I look back on my life, the most rotten part, the bit that rises the most anger in me is when I think back on my very early education. I was too young to be able to question, and everything was taught to me at school, because I was away at boarding school from a very young age, by missionary teachers, all telling me this is what is, and it aligns with the Bible. And denial of evolution and support of creationism was absolutely a part of that. I'm mostly over it now, but certainly in the early days after my deconversion, I was very, very angry about that stage of my life, because that losing faith is very much a loss. You very definitely go through a grieving process, because it's an entire part of your identity that has died and fallen away. And you have to deal with the consequence of that. And part of the consequence of that is looking back over your life and going, could I have fixed this sooner? Were there warning signs sooner? And for me it was especially problematic for me because of those early years in my life where I was absolutely indoctrinated, where I, without question, accepted what was told to me by adults who should have known better. And it's really, really hard dealing with the anger that you feel towards those people and the shame of you accepting all of those beliefs. And I had to keep reminding myself, I was in single-digit years of age. I can't blame anybody.
Yeah.
I can't take this on myself. I need to be kinder to myself. And that was a lot of processing to go through. Did you have anything similar to that yourself?
Yeah, I mean, my level of indoctrination sounds like just as severe as yours. Like I was my parents got religion kind of early, and I think it was partially as a result of, them getting pregnant with me before they were married. And they were like, oh shit, this is a sin. They were both raised Catholic. And then, so I think there was some guilt and shame right from the onset for them. And yeah, I never had a chance to critically think about any of these things, because obviously when you're, Christians like to use the term age of accountability related to the idea of like when a kid's old enough to make a decision for themselves. Yeah. And they put that age somewhere around, 10 or 12 or something like that. But really, if you think about it, like if you're living in your parents' house and you're relying on them for food and shelter and clothing and support, you can't really make a decision that is about eternity outside of what they're teaching you without it having grave consequences. I know some kids, that rebelled against their parents in other ways, not necessarily religion, and they got kicked out of their house, So I could easily see in my tradition, if I, at 10 years old, decided to start questioning my faith, it would have been immediately shut down. There would have been punishment and all that kind of stuff. And I could see it could have led to something more drastic, like, hey, get out, and go live somewhere else, though. But I don't think, looking at how my parents are, I don't think they would have done that. But they would have been very upset and tried to figure out some way to bring me back in. And, with that mode of parenting, it would have probably been a more aggressive style of coercion back into, believing. So I never really challenged it or thought about it. And then when I did look back at it later, I realized that same thing, like, oh man, I didn't have the ability to even critically think at all. I wasn't given that opportunity to critically think outside of the spectrum of what Christianity is. There was plenty of times I heard the terms critical thinking in church or I went to Christian school and Christian college. They were always talking about critically thinking and being like a Berean, like Paul said, digging into the scriptures and understanding what it said. But it was always from that circular support structure, where you're getting your support from within the thing that's already being supported. It was a very circular reasoning process. There was never any, oh, well, look at the outside corroboration of such and such story from the Bible or such and such idea. That was never really presented. And it wasn't until I started looking at things externally that I realized, oh, there's not really a lot of support for this stuff. And that happened kind of way later. Like even after I kind of deconverted, I started digging into the Bible itself with Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar who deconverted not because of the Bible, but he continues to dig into the Bible and point out all these things. And I found that really fascinating as a scholar type person. I don't consider myself a scholar because I'm not that smart, but like, not, at least not on Bart Ehrman's level. He's got multiple PhDs and stuff. Yeah, he's a genius. But like when he started pointing out these things, I would be like, oh man, I remember being taught that exact thing that you said, and then how they would just skip over, why these gospels don't harmonize, or why there's two different creation stories, or why there's two different birth of Jesus stories, or, all that kind of stuff. And then when you started to see the scholarly explanation for it, you were like, oh, they just wanted you to accept it. They didn't want you to actually know what was behind it. They just wanted you to believe it. And once you get past that point, then it starts to really cause some cracks,
Yes, it does. It absolutely does. One of the moments for me, although again this was a creeping realization, was my questioning coincided with me having a young child at home. And again, to plug my back catalogue, I had a fabulous conversation. Andrew and I had a fabulous conversation with John Steingard, the ex-lead singer of the Hawk Nelson band. And just after he came out as no longer believing, he did a round of interviews on various podcasts, and I managed to blag him for still unbelievable. We had a fabulous conversation, but he talks about the problem of evil as part of being very instrumental in it. And I know Christians have got answers to the problem of evil. Christian, if you're listening to this, your answers to the problem of evil don't go far enough. They are not good enough to overcome it. Please pay attention to that fact. Right. So he talks about that, and he talks about his experience in Africa and seeing all of these people in really difficult, horrible situations, and them as Christians doing their best to have a small but ultimately ineffectual effort to try to make some lives a little bit less shitty, and thinking, well, God could just fix all of this.
Right.
And he says his experience of becoming a parent made him realize that this God that would doom some of his creation, who he allegedly loves like a parent loves their children, to an horrific end times torture, but he could never do that to his own child. And I went through a similar creeping realization where, as my own parent, you asked me the simple question, is there anything that my child could do that would separate them from my love? Is there anything my child could do that would cause me to lock my child in the basement away and not see me again? No.
Right. No.
There isn't. And this realization that me, as an imperfect human, would not reject my child. There is nothing my child could do that would not want me to hug my child and to do my best to help make life better for my child. I would absolutely do everything I possibly could. And yet God would simply reject and banish me for daring to say, "Are you there, God?"
Right. Yeah, and it's funny because when you hear it explained like that, I can still hear the like Christian apologetic response to that, when it's just always like, well, he sent Jesus, but that doesn't hold a lot of water. Like that doesn't make any sense, because for one, the vast majority of the population doesn't know anything about who Jesus was or whatever. The historical like data about Jesus is sketchy at best, as if he, for one, even existed as a human being, and for two, was God. I mean, they were arguing about if Jesus was God in the early church, like thousands of years ago. Like, and there was whole sects and battles between the different like realms of Christianity about, well, was Jesus God, or was he half God? Was he man and God? You know, and if they didn't have it figured out 150, 200, 300 years after Jesus supposedly walked the planet, why in the hell would you think you have it figured out now, 3,000 years later? Like, and so the problem of evil caused me some problems too, because I was like, and on top of that was the Epicurean paradox. Like, if God is all knowing and all loving and all powerful, he can't be all three of those things, because if he knew that we were going to fall and did nothing about it, well, he can't be all loving. If he couldn't do anything about it, he's not all powerful. And if he did know and then chose to do nothing, well, then he's just an asshole, you know? And so like people will say, well, if you found out today that God was real, would you believe? And I am like, I don't really know that I could accept or, you know, want to believe in a God that treats his creation the way he does, you know, and that would be a different thing. Like, you're accepting the fact that there's a God. Okay. I would probably accept the fact that there's a God, but I would deal with the consequences, you know, because that's not the kind of person I would want to like live my life for, or, you know, I wouldn't treat my own kids that way. And, you know, my own kids they drive me insane sometimes, but yeah, like you said, I wouldn't lock them in the basement for all of eternity, you know, like no matter what they did, you know, and I'm pretty damn flawed. Like, you know, I fuck up a lot, you know, and I wouldn't do that. Like, so how could someone who claims to be all loving as a primary characteristic do that to people simply because they don't believe in them, or worse, they haven't even heard of them?
Yes.
You know, so that doesn't seem very loving to me, because certain people like won the geographical lottery and were born in a place where, oh, I could hear about Jesus, but there's millions of people that were born somewhere where they're going to hear about Buddha, they're going to hear about Allah, or they're going to hear about some other, or no God at all. And they seem to be, a lot of them are doing just fine. You know, they still have a base of morality. They're not, they're not doing things that are heinous and disgusting, you know, and somehow are they able to do that without God, which is another problem for me, was the whole idea of having morality only be based on your religion. You know, we had Bart Campolo on our podcast, I think in season 1, I think, and he's a famous son of a preacher himself, and then deconverted, actually wrote the foreword to our book. So that's a quick plug.
Bless him for that. Yes.
Which is
I
cool.
am going to try and reach out to him, see if I can have a conversation.
Oh, he's fantastic. But he was talking about, now I forgot where I was going with this story. He was talking about the geographical lottery, and like, if you didn't luck out to be born in a place where God of the Bible was the one that you were taught, well, then you're screwed, which that just doesn't make any sense, you know. And Rachel Held Evans talks about that a lot in her book too. Like, I happen to be born in the Bible Belt in the South, and that's how I landed in the right version of Christianity. Like, that's just really lucky. Good for me, you know, but what about the other people that weren't, you know?
Yes, exactly. And on that subject of, you know, if you're convinced that God existed, would you turn back to Christianity? Would you love that God back, or even worship that God? I've got several answers to that. You know, you've got to do more than just convince me that God is real. I mean, that's a pretty big hurdle for you to get over, for starters, but you've got to do more than just convince me that God exists and that your preferred version of God exists. You've got to convince me that God is a good God, because I have a problem with that God being a good God. And then on top of that, you've got to convince me that worshipping a being is actually a moral thing to do, because I actually think that worshipping anything is an immoral act anyway. So you've got to get me back over that hurdle at all. There's a reason why every part of fiction that we've got, the bad guy is the one that demands absolute unquestioning loyalty. There's a reason why it's Donald Trump who is the one who is demanding of unparalleled, unquestioned loyalty. It's always the shitty people. There's a reason why Hitler demanded unparalleled loyalty. It's always the shitty people that demand worship and loyalty.
Right. Yeah. It goes back to that character of God thing. Like, and it's funny because I think back to my Christian days, and you hear about, the wonder of what God is and how good he is and how loving he is. But then the explanations that they use to support that are usually the most non-loving things possible. Like God loved you so much that, for one, he sent his own kid to earth to die.
Yep.
Okay. That as a Christian, that made perfect sense to me as the ultimate sacrifice, right? But now looking at it, I'm going, well, what kind of shitty person does that? Like, I would never do that to my own kid. Now, if a person, they will say, well, he voluntarily did it, blah, blah, blah. There's obviously no documentation to prove that Jesus voluntarily, left heaven to come down and become a Jewish carpenter and they get nailed to a cross 33 years later. There's no proof of that. There's plenty of stories in human history where people have voluntarily sacrificed for someone that they loved, or for their country, or for some ideal. And sometimes that ideal is wrong. Those 9/11 hijackers sacrificed their lives for what they believed in. Does that make them loving and correct? Probably not. It just means that they were dedicated highly to something that they believed in. It doesn't, just because you're highly dedicated to something doesn't mean that you're right, or that what you're dedicated to is factually correct. And I think that's something that being outside of Christianity, you start to learn. I had never heard of the concept of epistemology, really, like the idea of like, how do we know things are true? And we had Anthony I can't remember his last name.
Montegusto, something like that.
I want to say Monteleone, but that's another guy. But Anthony Magnabosco, that's it. And he has a YouTube channel called Street Epistemology, where he would just go into streets, usually on colleges, and he would just engage people in conversation, not with the idea of convincing them to not believe in God, but to help them unpack the idea of, well, how and why do you believe what you believe? And what would it take for you not to believe that, if there was anything? And I find those interviews were fascinating. I didn't find them till I was after I'd really deconverted, but I found them fascinating because I was like, man, I wish I would have ran into this guy, when I was 12 or 13 years old somewhere, or in college, because I would have been like, I probably would have argued with him just like a lot of the people on the show, but maybe it would have planted something in there to say, because if you take that principle of how anything is true and apply it to things outside of religion, you realize that the test for faith doesn't work for anything else. If it takes something simple. Yesterday, I installed a bidet on my toilet. Okay.
Well, hey!
So, yeah, it's great fun. My in-laws had one. We were down there over the summer, and I was like, ooh, this is fun. The kids liked it. It's great, whatever. Okay, there is a point to the story.
Get the temperature right. Rule number one.
Yes, get the temperature right. But there's a point to the story that has to do with this. But, there's a clear set of instructions that I followed to install this bidet. It was very simple. Now, if I decided that, do I believe these instructions or am I going to install this thing based on faith, or am I going to do it based on what the actual instructions say? There's no other area of a person's life where they do things based on faith. You do almost everything based on data and facts and, something. If you're buying a house, you're going to do the research about the neighborhood where you're going to, the schools, then you're going to do the financial research. Can I afford it? What's the interest rate? Like, you do all of this factual collection before you make a decision. And if you don't do that, a lot of times that decision sometimes goes wrong. Even if you do it with all the facts, sometimes it goes wrong. So it makes sense to make your decisions based on data and based on research and based on evidence. I think it was Anthony that was talking about the difference between evidence and proof. A lot of people say there's no proof for this, there's no proof for that. And they're right, because there's very things that have actual proof. There's a lot of things that have a mountain of evidence to support it, like evolution, a mountain of evidence. They say, well, it doesn't make it true. Okay, but I've got a mountain of evidence that would suggest that this is true. And you have a mountain of nothing that you want me to believe is true. And that's I don't know which one makes more sense. And I don't remember who told me the idea of like applying that test of faith to other aspects of life. You just wouldn't do it, and if it doesn't work in every aspect of your life, then why would you have it be the primary thing that you base, in this case, your soul and eternity on, if that even exists, which again, what's the evidence say about that? Like, what is the evidence for the afterlife? What is the evidence for the soul? Like, apply this to every aspect of your life. And then you start to realize, oh, there are ways to know things. And then there's ways to understand and having to be okay with, I don't know this. And that is a real hard thing for, a lot of fundamentalists to do, because everything we did was black and white, So the idea of being okay with, I don't know how that works, but it does. And I'm sure there's someone smarter than me that eventually is going to figure it out, and I'm okay with that, and that maybe somebody would consider that faith, but to me, that's not faith. That's just saying we haven't got the evidence for it yet, and that's different.
That's right. Do you ever get told you're just as much a man of faith as a Christian is?
I haven't been directly told that, I think I have engaged some people who say, oh, well, atheism is just as much of a religion as Christianity is. And it's the same idea of like, well, you have to have faith to believe in evolution, or you have to have faith to be an atheist. And obviously that's ridiculous, because you don't need to have faith. You have to have no evidence. It's right there in the definition.
Yes.
Faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. The promise of things not seen. Yeah. Like, it's right there in the definition. It's baked right in. It's a feature, not a bug.
Yes.
It's so, I think by that very nature, there's a vast chasm between the idea of faith and evidence and faith and reason, because reason, and it doesn't mean that every logical conclusion is correct. No. Which is another thing. People say, well, science has flaws. Science is always finding out things that are wrong. And I'm like, Yes, science has admitted that it's wrong many, many times. How many times has Christianity admitted that it was wrong? Even in the face of things that are really fucking wrong. Like the Southern Baptist Convention covering up sexual abuse for the past 50 years and having a list of pastors who are abusing kids. Did they ever come out and say, all these people are wrong, all these people are fired? No, they just covered it up and they moved them to another church, or we forgave him because he got, he said sorry. He says sorry because he got fucking caught. Now I'm getting sweary because that pisses me off.
It does. We've literally going through that scandal here in the UK. Within the last 6 months, the most senior Christian in the UK, the Archbishop of Canterbury, resigned his post because of his relationship with somebody who was involved in the abuse of young children.
Yeah, it happens so much. It's like one of the few places that I put on my personal social media about Christianity things, because I think it's like we have a duty on some level to expose people to the hypocrisy that they're living in. Because when you say that it's gay and trans people that have an agenda and they're trying to ruin the world with their life, I've yet to post an article about a trans person who has been abusing a kid, or they're always a pastor. They're always a youth minister. They're always the Archbishop of Canterbury, for fuck's sake. You're the biggest religious figure in a country and you're just doing the worst things possible. It's always these people that are doing it. And I think there's a point where you need to expose this, because the more you expose it, the more people, and sorry, I'm tangenting a little, but every time I post one of those articles there was one in my own town. It was a pastor who was a youth pastor here who was abusing kids in the youth group. I didn't have one Christian, and I'm friends with Christians still on my social media. I didn't have one Christian comment on those posts and say, that's disgusting. That dude should be fired. I hope he rots in hell. I hope he goes to jail, blah, 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 blah. You get crickets from these people. They're not even willing to condemn things that are obviously wrong. And that to me, I don't understand. For me, if I see something that's obviously wrong, I'm going to say something about it, whether it's Christian or if it's an atheist who says something that's obviously wrong. I'm not going to sweep it under the rug just because they don't believe in God. You could still be a shithead and be an atheist, and you can still be wrong about things, and you can still be a bad person, and do bad things, So I feel like there's a level of accountability that just is not there.
No, it's not. It's and I do this all the time here on Still Unbelievable. I put notes and links in the show notes below every podcast, and I have said multiple times during shows, if what I have just said is wrong, here is the email address, reasonpress@gmail.com. Send me a note, tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah,
because being corrected is a good thing. And
absolutely.
On that subject, that was one of the things, and I've mentioned this multiple times, one of the things that was an unexpected consequence of me exiting Christianity was mentally, I found it easier to be able to admit that I'd done something wrong. While I was a Christian, even things that were unrelated to Christianity, even things that were inconsequential, even things that the worst that could happen was people would laugh at me. Admitting that I cocked up and done something wrong was a genuinely painful thing that I avoided doing. And I even lied to friends over petty things rather than admit that I'd been wrong about something or just literally made a mistake.
Right. And do you think that comes from the idea of everything having moral value when you're a Christian? Even the smallest inconsequential things, you can't admit you're wrong because it has eternal consequences. Yeah. Was that your experience of Christianity?
Yeah, I think what it was because admitting I was wrong about something unrelated or inconsequential opened up the door to admitting I might be wrong about Christianity.
Okay.
I think that was the way that my mind was working on that one.
Consciously?
And subconsciously.
Okay, yeah. I was going to say, that's
it's me post-exit psychoanalyzing myself. I might be wrong. I'm not a psychologist, but I know me. And I know mostly how my brain works. So I think that's what was going on in my mind.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's the whole idea of every decision you make has this huge weight to it. The fact, one of my huge pet peeves in Christianity is the idea of the providence of God, and that God has this overarching view and plan for your life, and that he cares about you down to the intimate details of your life, which when you're a Christian, it sounds fantastic. But when you are looking at it from the outside, it's disgusting, because you're like, if God is looking at the whole of the universe and he has a plan for everyone's life, and he cares about me getting a parking space at Target, right? And he's intimately involved in that. But at the same time, there's a massive genocide going on in Gaza. To me, that's providence gone wrong. I would rather circle the parking lot for all of eternity and have God deal with the millions of people being killed in Palestine and get his priorities right. So the idea of this, his plan and his ways are higher than our ways, that is the thing that just gets me agitated to no end, because I'm like, how could he have a plan? What's the plan here? Everything that goes wrong in a Christian's life, oh, well, God had a plan for it. But everything that goes right, God gets the credit for it. And everything that goes wrong, he doesn't ever get the blame for it. They just kind of go around and say, well, he has some reason for why this happened, which I understand is a psychological protection mechanism. You don't want to accept that shitty things happen and that, maybe they were your fault, or maybe just shit happens, that's perfectly fine to accept, but that concept of providence, and the overarching plan for the universe and for humanity, it drives me insane. I don't know how you feel about that.
I do. I feel the same. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical question at you, Phil. Obviously, because I'm God, I know this is a hypothetical question that will never happen, but I'm going to ask anyway. So a freak tornado blows through the area, the residence, suburb, whatever it is in which you live, and it destroys your house and your neighbour's house and a couple of other houses. And you come back and you examine the damage of your house. And there, where your front door used to be, you find an undamaged Bible.
You're saying this is hypothetical. I just saw an article of this just the other day about the freaking hurricane that hit North Carolina. North Carolina, in towns that I've been in, actually I worked at a Christian camp in the place where the hurricane went through, destroyed this entire town. And the only thing left standing in this one area was the cross that was attached to the church. The cross was there, church completely gone, but the cross was there. And people are posting, oh, look at this awesome sign from God that the cross will stand forever. Even
it's a tragedy. It's not funny,
even through Hurricane Helene, which people are still devastated from. Entire towns were literally wiped off the map. But God left a cross standing? Like, I'm sorry. It's like, what the fuck? How can you look at a situation like that and then say, well, here's this tiny, I understand glimmer of hope and all that stuff. You need something to get through hard times. It makes sense psychologically. But how could you really look at that situation and say God was in control of 20-foot crests of water washing away a town and killing people, and thousands of people died in there? Like, why would he save the cross and not the people? To me, so your story was probably supposed to be hypothetical, but I literally saw an article just like that not that long ago, and it's like
what you're saying, Phil, is that doesn't convince you, that doesn't switch the needle for you at all.
No. If anything, it cements the idea that God isn't. For me, it cements the idea that there's nobody at the controls.
Yeah.
Which I understand is very disconcerting. For me, sometimes it would be nice to think, hey, it'd be nice to know that someone was at the controls, but things happen. Nature is violent. There are tragedies. There are people who do bad things. There's so many things that are happening in the world that if there was an all-powerful, all-loving God, he could instantly fix. Mm-hmm. The first thing he could do is he could instantly show us that, hey, I'm real.
Yep.
Not do it through a book that's written over 1,500 years by 40 different people and has full of historical errors. Why would you reveal yourself that way if you were real? Why? It doesn't make sense. It's like, I mean, to me, it's like the Wizard of Oz. We just saw Wicked not too long ago, and I saw a lot of interesting theological parallels in that movie that I was like, oh man, this is a lot like Christianity. The wizard was an asshole. He's lording his power over all of Oz, and he was just trying to get the power from a tiny little person that actually had some actual power. And then he wanted to use it for his own good. That to me seems like what, if God was real, that's what he's doing. So for me, I don't find the idea of providence or sovereignty of God a convincing argument at all. If anything, it's more damning than convincing.
Yes, quite. To rewind the conversation a little bit, when we were talking about the problem of evil, there's an analogy that I find useful in all of this, and this whole bit about Jesus' alleged sacrifice, because I don't know how you can describe as a sacrifice something that you get back 3 days later. But anyway, that's by the side. But the analogy, if my child broke both their legs, was in hospital, was in genuine pain, was in genuine agony, was crying out for me to do something about it, and I had the power to fix those legs. But instead, what I did was I broke my own 2 legs and then lay in bed next to her for the weekend and said, here I am, darling, I'm suffering with you.
Right.
That would not make my daughter better.
No.
That would not make my daughter feel better.
No, I wouldn't think so. And it might make your daughter think, oh, well, that's really nice of dad to do that, but it doesn't help me any. Now you got 2 people with broken legs and neither of us can go anywhere. And then if he can magically fix it 3 days later, well, why didn't you do it 3 days earlier? To me, that's, it's not a sacrifice. There's a funny meme. I think it's it says that God gave up his weekend for your sins,
Yes.
It's like, okay, when you look at it that way, you're like, yeah, it's not really that big. Again, he also knew if he was God, he knew he was going to resurrect.
Yeah.
So you can go through a lot of pain and a lot of stuff if you know what the outcome is on the other side. Mm-hmm. This is true of human beings too. Put it in an athletic context. You could be really tired playing some given sport, but well, this game is only 60 minutes long, or this quarter is only 15 minutes long. I can push through this thing. Or if you're running a race, I've only got to get to the finish line. I can push So it's not, the grandeur of the sacrifice isn't really all that grand if you think about it logically, again, which isn't allowed.
Yes, yes. So, but on the subject of that, and going through some of the story that you've written for this book, Phil, you went through some of your own trauma as an adult, if I dare say it. The bit that jumped out on me, and I hope you don't mind me bringing it up, but the bit that jumped on me is the failure of your marriage. I found that quite emotional to read through. I'm a child of divorced parents, so I know what it was like for my parents to go through a particularly painful divorce. I know what it was like for the child. So I can only imagine how difficult and shocking and painful that was. And and you talk about the church you're at the time, there were people there who were supportive of you.
Yeah.
What impact did that experience have on your Christianity at the time?
Well, it's interesting, and I think I kind of tell the story because, I mean, I was kind of blindsided by the divorce itself. Like I tell in the story, like I tried to do marriage God's way. I was brought up in purity culture, so I was saved myself for marriage, and so did my wife at the time. We were together for 12 years and married for 10 or something like that, and came home one day and all her stuff was gone. So I was like, oh shit, and the faith community that I was part of at that time, I think if I would have been part of any other faith community at that time, I'm not really sure how I would have gotten through it. So it's a credit to those people. And at the time, I don't think I connected my faith per se to what those people did to help me. Like, to me, and this is kind of the nature of this particular community, it was very much about meeting people's needs and seeing people where they are and helping them. And so to me, it only solidified for me the idea that if you are a child of God, then this is how you should treat people. Now, I grew up in a tradition where if you got divorced, you were basically shunned, like divorce was preached against from the pulpit. My parents have been married for, I don't know, 30, 40, I think they're coming up on their 50th anniversary. And there's probably times where I was like, why are you guys together? Like, because divorce was so anathema to them, and I think in the book, I tell the story that Jerry Falwell, who's a very famous, preacher over here where I went to his college, he used to say from the pulpit, divorce is never an option. Murder maybe, but not divorce. And he would say that jokingly, ha ha ha. But like, I feel like there's probably more Christians that would kill off their spouse before they would divorce because of the stigma of divorce, So I was kind of, for lack of a better term, I was blessed, to be in a faith community that did not view that as a stigmatic thing. I did receive a lot of stigma from my Christian family, and I still feel that stigma today, even though I'm now,
sorry.
I'm remarried 8 years and have kids and all that kind of stuff. But I still feel like on somewhat level that divorce was the beginning of like the black sheep status, in the family. But it's interesting because all the things I tell a story in the book about several things that happened through the course of my Christian journey that you would think would have made me go, hey, God, fuck you. Like, I don't believe if you're there, you're really not doing a great job. But I never blamed it on God. I never blamed it on the system. I always just was like, well, that's people. Or in the case of the marriage, it was like, well, it happens, and I think that being in that faith community, which I credit my deconversion actually a lot to that faith community because they gave me the permission to ask a lot of questions. And those questions led for me to deconversion, but to other people, it leads to a deepening of their faith, and kudos to them if that's what it does, as long as they're not hurting people or whatever. But to me, the divorce and how that all went, it didn't cause me to question my faith. If anything, it helped me see that, like, okay, if someone says that they're a believer, this is how they should treat people. So the divorce didn't have any impact on me walking away from Christianity, which I don't know if that's good or bad. Like, okay. I mean, I think I was so deeply indoctrinated, even as I progressed out, it was a pretty hard stop when I got to the point where I was like, oh, I can't believe in God anymore, because I was really clinging to that as long as I possibly could, So,
are there any children from that marriage?
No, we did not have any kids. It was honestly a very amicable divorce. It was painful, obviously, but we didn't have any kids. We kind of still remained friendly. Like, it's interesting because in a divorce, usually the people pick sides. In this divorce, like, her whole family was on my side, which is kind of weird for her, but it's all come around. But I'm still in contact with some of her family. Every once in a while they'll message me about something or whatever. Actually, she herself actually messaged me not too long about the podcast. It was like, hey, I found the podcast. I've been listening to it. It's really good. And I'm like, okay, cool, interesting. So
is she still a Christian?
I don't think so. I don't.
Right.
I've never seen her. I mean, again, I don't communicate with her regularly,
okay.
but she lives in Germany now. And she's in some kind of relationship. She may be remarried. I'm not sure. But I don't know what her faith status was. But I do know that she's commented on things that I've commented on, with things that are more in line with not being a Christian anymore. Or if she's still some kind of Christian, it's certainly not the type of Christian that we were before, when we were married. So
I'm going to be a little bit cheeky, because this is a segue to an experience I had in Christianity. You were both obviously sinning because you didn't have any children.
Oh, correct. Of course, and that was actually, it's funny you say that, because when we first got married, there was two other couples that we were really good friends with in the Calvary Chapel Church that we went to, and none of us had kids, and we used to all hang out together and talk about how we were the no kid club, and we used to kind of make fun of all the other parents that were our age that had kids and couldn't go out and do anything and all that kind of stuff. And but for me, that was actually a subjugation of what I wanted. And even when we first got married, she said, well, I don't know that I ever want to have kids. And I was like, oh, okay. We were young, and I was like, okay, whatever, thinking that at some point she's going to turn around this idea of wanting to have a family, because one, the Christian thing of like, well, you can't be married and not have kids. I mean, that's ridiculous. And for two, I just thought, well, we're young and, maybe we'll get there. Well, she never did get there. She has no kids. I don't think she literally knew herself well enough at that time, that she didn't want to have kids. And I did not know myself well enough to say, oh, put on the brakes. This is not a relationship that you should pursue, because this is not going to lead you to, because there's emotional stuff and infatuation and all that kind of stuff. Plus, when you are in your 20s or whatever and you haven't had sex yet, you're like, I need to get married because I need to get laid, so there's that factor too. And that tends to, maybe blind your decision-making process.
Purity culture has a lot to answer for.
Yeah. Purity culture is probably what I think one of the most destructive parts of religion and Christianity. And
it forces people to get married way too young, often people who shouldn't get married just because they want some titties. Yeah.
I mean, it's a very real thing, and people don't know about it. They think, oh, we're doing it God's way. Purity, the idea of staying pure until marriage sounds good on some level, but the reality of how human biology works, it doesn't make sense. There's compatibility things that they're physical. They're not spiritual. Like, so that's a whole nother can of worms, but that's another topic I get pretty fired up about too, because when I think about like the amount of experience, not just, oh, I missed out on having sex as a young person. That's not so much of it, but the way I viewed myself and the way I viewed women and the way I viewed sexuality was so damaged by that concept that's something that really pisses me off when I think about it. And it's part of the reason and it's something that still sticks in there when I see certain things that purity culture clicks on. I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and she'll come downstairs wearing something, and I have to turn off the purity culture light even still, to say, okay, why am I reacting to that outfit or whatever? And what does it say? What message is it sending to her about herself? If I jump down her throat about what she's wearing or whatever, so there's a whole another can of worms that, especially for guys in purity culture, obviously purity culture, extremely damaging to women, but there's aspects of purity culture for men that are damaging as well. And I like that that's coming out a little bit as well. There's men speaking out and talking about it. And it gives you a level of empathy to understand what women were going through and girls from the youngest of ages, like what they were being taught about themselves and subsequently what we were being taught about ourselves, in relation to how we interact with them. So, some of which is the cause of a lot of this sexual abuse and stuff. When you're taught as a guy that women are sub to you, that they're property and that they're owed, when you're married, they owe you sex and all this kind of stuff, that's going to fuck up your view about how you view people, So yeah, again, big sidebar. That's, maybe a whole nother, that's another book, but yeah, it's very damaging and something that, it still lingers with me. Like even now as a almost 50-year-old guy,
there are a few things more terrifying for a man than having a daughter, frankly.
I got 3 of them. So
yes. Well, my daughter's away at university. She's 20. She has a boyfriend. They've been dating for about a year now. They see a lot of each other. It is unhelpful for me to spend any time thinking about what they might get up to. I know what it's like to be a red hot-blooded 22-year-old. It helps nobody, me spending time thinking about that. All I should concentrate on is having a productive, healthy relationship with my daughter.
Right. Well, and it also goes back to that idea of science and data. Like educating your relationship with your daughter at that age isn't what, I mean, obviously you want to protect her so she doesn't make bad decisions about something, but your role is to like make sure that she knows about sexuality and health and taking care of herself physically and emotionally, because there's that in a relationship, there's emotion involved. So that's where you can have a totally different relationship with an adult child when you're not viewing them as like some little flower that's going to get broken, but as a fully functioning human being,
or future property of a man.
Or future property of a man. Yeah, I mean, it's a whole different can of worms, and that outlook.
And moratoriums do not promote that kind of positive relationship.
No, of course not.
No. So the thing that I wanted to segue onto, and it was while I was still a Christian, my wife and I, or rather it was mainly me, for a short period of time. Again, this is when bulletin boards and email lists were a thing, because we didn't have social media at that point. Facebook wasn't a thing, and we didn't have internet forums where you could do this thing. So things were bulletin boards and mail lists, if you're old enough to know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I was on a Third Culture Kids mail list, and we would chat around things. And for some reason, the subject of having children came up. And my wife and I were heading towards, or around about 10 years of marriage. We're both involved in the youth group. And I made some kind of comment about, we're childless. I'm okay being childless. I like being childless. And what childless means is I am more able to commit to things in the church that I wouldn't otherwise be able to be, including the church youth group and being part of the church youth group and committing multiple nights a week to the church youth group. And I like having that freedom to be able to do that. Yeah. One person on that board said, "What a lovely attitude." Everybody else, "You are a shitty person for not having children."
Right. Yeah. Well, and the pressure to have kids, like now I have 4 kids, 2 biological and 2 from my wife's previous marriage. So I got 4 kids in the house from ages 6 to 14. There's an aspect where now you have no life that is around your kids. And for some reason in the church, that's viewed as like some kind of sainthood.
Yeah.
Like that's your calling, and especially for the mother, you're like, that's what they're called to do or whatever. And like, but it's not for everybody. Like some days I feel like it's not for me, to be honest. Like, I'm like, oh God, like this is exhausting.
It's hard work, but
it's like, and so I feel like now there's definitely a shift, and I don't know how it is in the UK, but here there's definitely a shift of like people waiting a little bit longer to have kids.
Yeah,
and
it's a
but you
very
do see
real
this
trend,
more,
yeah.
but you see that more in the secular world where they're not being pushed at from 18 to get married and to have a kid by 20. And like, you still see that in a lot of places. And like, quite frankly, you're not at 20 years old or 21 years old, you're not equipped to handle a kid. Like if you have a kid and they turn out good, that is pure luck, and you might have been just a very well built person emotionally to be able to handle that. But by and large, like you need a level of maturity in your own and your own marriage and your own relationship before you're ready to have kids. And there shouldn't be that pressure to have kids. It's one of those things. It's a decision between those two people. It shouldn't be mandated by anyone else. It'd be the same if the government started mandating, well, you better have a kid by the time you're 25. They're trying to mandate everything else. I could see them,
Yes.
It's like going to be the Handmaid's Tale over here in like 20 something days, but yeah, like that's a decision that's between the family.
Yeah. I've said on multiple occasions, I'd have been a really shitty parent if I'd been a parent in my 20s. Yeah. Right. I mean, I wasn't perfect. I'm still not perfect, but I'd have been even less perfect if I'd been a parent in my 20s.
Yeah.
I'm better for it for having waited. I still had to learn a heck of a lot.
Yeah. How long have you been doing Still Unbelievable, and how did you get into podcasting?
Yes.
A little bit.
It's 5 or 6 years now. I think we're Still Unbelievable now. So Still Unbelievable started as a book.
Okay.
Basically, because for those who are familiar, Justin Briley's Unbelievable podcast, and that's where the unbelievable bit comes from. So Justin Briley, UK Christian, he was doing the Unbelievable podcast, which started off as a radio show before becoming a podcast here in the UK. And Justin pitched that as conversations between Christians and non-Christians, and just to push things along. And it became moderately successful, but it really took off when it became a podcast. And Justin started picking up loads and loads of non-Christian listeners to the radio show. I became a very big fan of the podcast. And I have joked on more than one occasion that it's the only religious podcast I listen to religiously. I feel that it has lost a little bit of its shine in recent years. But certainly some of the conversations that it had were of good value. And for me, during my deconstruction and my doubting and my questioning, I found it extremely useful, and it helped me to formulate some of my questions. And it really showed me that thinkers who are atheists, who I didn't really know how to reach out to and how to access, it made them available to me, and it gave me exposure to ideas and answers that I wouldn't have otherwise been able to find. Mm-hmm. So I'm really thankful for the service that gave me. But what it did do was it just helped cement my exit. It helped pave that road for me getting out, because I just simply didn't engage with the Christian answers. I found them lacking, insufficient, and I found that the atheistic explanations of things, and certainly when scientists came on and did things and they were able to explain and describe things without need to posit God, made so much sense.
Right.
So that's where that came on. And then after he'd been doing that show for 10 years, Justin wrote a book, Unbelievable. Why after 10 years of talking with atheists, I'm still Christian. And various people decided to get together, various atheists said, we should do a counteract to this book. And this was after Justin announced it, before the book had even came out. And so I jumped on board with that, wrote a couple of chapters for the book, and various people got together, wrote that book, and we put it out within a year of Justin's original book going out. And we did that self-published. It needs an edit, it needs a re-edit, it probably needs an addition too. There are a couple of mistakes and poor edits that are in that book. I hold my hand up as being partly responsible, at very least, for some of those errors, and those certainly need correcting. But I would love to get an addition to pushed out with a few extra chapters and get the edits put through on that. So that book came out. And then a year after that, David and Andrew, who'd been instrumental in that book, decided to kick up a podcast. So Still Unbelievable, the podcast came out from that, and then a couple of others off the back of that. Andrew and I were involved in, very briefly, a sideshow called Ask an Atheist Anything, but we tried that and we struggled with that for about a year or so, and decided that really didn't have any miles on it, and we preferred doing the Still Unbelievable content. So Andrew and I have been, and David and Andrew originally started on Still Unbelievable. I didn't join on doing episodes on Still Unbelievable for about a year after it had launched, I think. And then Andrew and I have basically been running Still Unbelievable for about the past 5 years now. And I love it. I didn't anticipate that I would get involved with this. It really wasn't on my radar to do. I thought I enjoyed writing a couple of chapters for the book and get involved in that. And but one of them thought that this would be a good outlet for me. I don't know why. But I found that I enjoyed it. I found that actually talking to a microphone, believing that people actually listened to me was something that stroked what little ego I had left. But I also found that joking apart, I have also found that it's exposed me to other voices I didn't think I would have. I've reached out to people and had really interesting conversations. I reached out to Joshua Somadas, for example, who wrote the book about the genealogical Adam and Eve, and I had a really good conversation with him. I've reached out to a couple of other Christians. I reached out to really Steve Chalk, who's a very popular Christian here in the UK, and had a really pleasant conversation with him. I reached out to John Steingard, who I mentioned earlier in this conversation, and had a really good conversation with him. But I've also landed on the radar of a publisher, and he's fed me a couple of the interviews that I've had over the last 2 years. And I've got another interesting interview with a British academic and historian coming up in a couple of months. So I'm really enjoying that aspect of this. And then as part of all that, I'm also experimenting with my own commentary on other Christian content where I've got a bit spiky and a little bit swearing. I'm wondering where to go with that, because I actually find I get much more out of the conversations. I get much more out of talking with people who've written the book, who are intelligent, and having a really good conversation, asking them questions about their book, about their content. I really enjoy that aspect of Still Unbelievable. I really enjoy those conversations that I have. I'm really thankful for the publishers that have been in touch with me to have those conversations. And if you're happen to be listening to this and you're an author or a publisher and you think there's an atheist who might want to talk to some of the content that you put out, get in touch. It will be great to have those conversations, whether it's a Christian or not a Christian. I do enjoy those questions because I haven't had a conversation with any other Christians who's written something where it's descended into anything even remotely unpleasant. It's always been a really useful, really interesting, genuinely challenging conversation. But then going back to the whole spiky bit, one of the episodes that I've done was one critiquing a John Lennox interview and he's a Christian apologist who I really dislike. I'll be straight up and honest about that. I probably don't even want to bother having a conversation with him. I genuinely don't like him. I consider him dishonest, and I think he strawmans atheist positions terribly in a lot of the commentary that he does. But he did appear on a friend's podcast, and I really didn't enjoy listening to that interview. They were very kind to him and they were very pleasant to him, but he put out a lot of nonsense, and I felt that particular episode it needed addressing. So with my friend's permission, I took that episode and I went through it and I went and fact checked every comment of John Lennox, and I called the episode When Belief Dies Kills John Lennox. And I've had feedback on that episode from one particular individual, but others as well. But one particular interview said that he listened to that episode while he was going through his deconstruction, and he found that my critiquing all of those and pointing out where John Lennox was making mistakes and misstating and misquoting, and that helped him to rationalize his thoughts and helped him out of Christianity. So I continue to do that kind of Christian commentary in my spiky, sarcastic way, because it has actually borne some fruit. And I am thinking about how I do it. Some people appreciate a bit of spikiness. My own journey out of Christianity was because of I had to endure some really unpleasant spikiness. So sometimes that works, but also sometimes we do need to be a little bit rational and thoughtful. So I try to do a balance of both types on Still Unbelievable. But Still Unbelievable isn't going anywhere, even though Andrew's managed to have himself in a business proposition where he's not as available as he used to be. I will have him back. That is a promise. But Still Unbelievable is not going to go away. It's still going to continue, and it's going to continue into 2025.
Awesome. Yeah, and that's cool. I think it's interesting, like because obviously kind of the atheist content universe has like kind of exploded, I think, over the last few years. And I think most of us that are somewhat new. Like I could still consider myself kind of new 3 or 4 years into it. And I was just on Stacey Grahn's podcast last week or 2 weeks ago, and she's even newer to the thing. She's kind of gotten a lot quicker notoriety and a big following. And she said, I never knew this content was out here.
Yeah.
And I think that's what is useful about it is like, it's not so much about like, getting viewers and listeners and, all the like getting famous or anything. It's more about like realizing that there's people that are benefiting from the stuff that we're talking about, and we're talking about different stuff in different ways. Like, so you might have an interview with a Christian person, and you can have a reasoned or maybe a not so reasoned conversation sometimes. And that's valuable that people see, oh, these two can interact and you can still respect each other.
Yeah. Yes, atheist, especially atheist YouTube is really, really popular. So I've only in the past year started putting the episodes or the back catalogue of Still Unbelievable up onto YouTube. There's obviously little no video there at all, but I'm finding it's getting listens. I just didn't realise. I'd have done it much sooner if I'd realised that people consume these things on YouTube, and maybe YouTube is the platform that everybody goes to for this, because the listen rate on YouTube is climbing faster than it ever did when I was doing just audio podcasts. Yeah. So YouTube is obviously where to go. So I've obviously got a new audience at YouTube, and there's people saying, "Oh, I've only just found this. I've been going around for 6 years."
Yeah, I started putting our stuff on there, I think about a year ago, because the platform that I use to record, they have a way that like basically automatically will upload it. So I created a channel for Flawed Theology as well, just to kind of put it up there. Again, it's just the audio. I keep wanting to use some of the video content, but I don't ever have time to edit and put stuff up there. But it's something that I would like to do in the future, because it does seem to be a good avenue to connect with people. So
yeah, so it'll be interesting to hear. So just talking technically then about podcasts a little bit then, because I put a lot of effort into editing the audio. I don't like ums, ahs, repeats, stumbles, and I go through the audio and take all that out, because out of 2 hours of audio, I can easily trim 10 minutes just by cutting unnecessary stuff. And I consider that a service to the listeners. They're getting the same quality, just in a shorter chunk. Perfect.
We try to do the same thing. But I'm notorious for saying "so" a lot, so you'll be editing a bunch of "so's" out of mine probably. And Susie actually was doing a lot of our editing, and we discovered there's some features in the editing software where it would actually take out the blank space. Like, so if there's a pause, it would just take out the silence automatically. And I'm like, oh, wish we'd have found this a couple of years ago. But it's pretty cool.
But the thought of doing that on video editing is a little bit painful, and it would also make watching it quite difficult, I imagine. So I haven't got in my headspace what I can do with that.
Yeah, that's part of our issue too. I'm like, I thought about doing like a Patreon type thing where here you get the raw unedited, video or something like that. But maybe people don't want that too, because then it's like, who wants to hear someone say and ah and so 50 times?
Yes, quite. I'm certainly not going to pay for it. No.
Right.
And sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes I can literally spend 8 hours editing 15 minutes out of 2 hour, 3 hour audio, and all I'm doing is deleting ums, ahs, ands, and repeats. So maybe I'm doing a little bit of cleanup where somebody has started saying something, changed their mind, said it again. So I spend a little time cleaning it all up so it comes across. And I think doing that to the audio helps your guest as well as it does your audience. So I think it's worth doing, but it is a lot of effort. It is a lot of commitment, but it means that I can't put the audio out straight away, which I'm fine with. I schedule it up, and I schedule it up for approximately every 2 to 3 weeks. Although I settle on a Sunday, but so it's either 2 to 3 weeks on the Sunday afternoon, the audio will go up, and there we go. And it doesn't matter when I record it, I'll just add it to the back of the schedule. Yeah,
that's kind of what we were trying to do, because our first year, we had difficulty like kind of getting into a routine of when we were going to record. And so then we decided for the second year, okay, we're going to release every 2 weeks, and we're going to record on this night. And we actually held through it all the way through the year. So that was good. So it does help to do that, but it's hard with life and kids and activities. And so the unsung work that it takes to do a podcast, it sounds easy, I guess, when it comes on the air, but there's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that has to happen. So
Yeah, some people I know, they record and they just chuck it straight up and they don't do anything with it. I'd rather do a pass through and an edit. I think it is a service. My audience does not owe me anything, and if I want them, I have to do something for them.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I have an appreciation for I haven't done, actually, I did my first live show a couple weeks ago, and it was a little nerve wracking because I'm like, oh, I'm used to being able to edit out. If I say something stupid, I'm like, well, this is just going to be live. Or if I had a technical issue, so on a live one, you can't really work around that. But so well.
Absolutely. So anything else that you want to talk about or ask about the book or our stories or anything, because we are here to plug the book, Apostate, Voices of Deconversion, available on Amazon and other online resellers. You can buy it as an ebook, as an audio book, and I believe as a print book as well. Mm-hmm. I'm told we're going to receive our own copies of print books. I'm looking forward to that, actually.
Yeah, me too. I asked Sarah about that. I was like, are we going to be able to get a copy of the book or should we just buy it? And she's like, oh, let me reach out to the publisher. And so she got us all copies of it, which was pretty cool. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. That'll be cool.
Excellent. So anything else you wanted to bring up about the whole experience of the writing or putting our stories down or anything?
No, I would just say, I mean, I hope people will go out and get the book. Like you mentioned, all the formats that it's in. I think the audio book comes out February the 25th, I think. Okay. I know Sarah has posted some clips of her recording some of the stories. I think people will really be shocked. I guess shocked is not really a word, but they'll really be challenged by the stories, because I think if you read the stories with an open mind and you realize that every one of us and all the thousands and millions of people who have gotten to this point of deconversion have done it not glibly. No. We have agonized. I mean, some of us have gone to our Bibles. We've gone to God. We've prayed. We've done all these things to try to get answers. And this is where we've landed. And if you really want to understand how people get to this point and not look for a reason to argue with them and try to convince them that they made a wrong decision or to try to reconvert them, then the book will be useful in that course. It doesn't mean you have to deconvert yourself. That's not the point of the book.
No.
Read the book so you can understand your fellow person that maybe you have been friends with for 25 years and you thought that the only thing you had in common was your faith, and you can realize that this person's still a person. They're not any different just because they believe something different as a person. So I hope people will enjoy that aspect of the book. And so I appreciate you having me on here, and we're going to kind of put this on the Flawed Theology podcast as well. So if you're a Flawed Theology podcast listener, this will be coming out in the next few weeks or so from when we recorded it. And since we're on kind of a limbo schedule ourselves, we'll get it out whenever we can get it out, and get it edited up and out to you guys. And so I just want to thank you, Matt, for having me on and giving me so much time, and it's been fun.
No problem. Always a pleasure. We should do this again, Phil. If you're listening to this on Still Unbelievable, links to Phil's content over at the Flawed Theology podcast, and the link to his website, which will have links to all of the social medias you can find Flawed Theology on, are down in the show notes. I don't know how much time you've got, Phil, but I usually like to end with a question about favorite Bible characters. Have you got capacity for that, or do I need to wave goodbye to you?
Yeah, let me do it real quick because my wife is waiting with the kids upstairs, and we got 4 or 5 hockey games today we got to get ready for. So, okay. But yeah, it's a funny question because I don't think I have a favorite Bible character, because I don't really give the Bible too much thought, except for as a work of fiction or a work of literature. So I don't know that I have a favorite character, but I do know, even as a believer, the characters that I appreciated the most were the violent ones. They were always the ones that were kind of challenging the status quo, which I guess maybe should have been something that I should have keened in on earlier, but in the Old Testament, the female judges that were doing things, or I think there was one named Deborah, that nailed a guy's head to the ground, that's a pretty aggressive move, but she was making a statement about, the God that she served. And there was several other people kind of throughout the Bible that were speaking truth to power. And I think that's something that always resonated with me, even as a Christian. And then as a post-Christian or an ex-Christian, I realize that there's a responsibility I think I have to speak truth to power, not only in the religious realm, because that's kind of why I do the accountability posts about sexual abuse in the church, but also to other structures that are systemically oppressing people, like structures around racism and poverty and human trafficking and things like that. So I think those type of characters are something that has always resonated with me. And now I don't know. I don't view the Bible characters as anything other than fictional characters, but I think some of them are interesting still on some level, but I don't give them any like eternal weight now. It's like, okay, well, let's look at this guy. And also I find it interesting to look at the characters like David, who is viewed as such a deified person in the Bible, and realize like how much of a slimeball he was, or Paul, this guy is like, he's the basis of all of Christianity, but really he was just a misogynist, like asshole kind of. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers like what people would normally answer in that situation, but that's probably what I would say.
It's funny you should say it, because I was trying to think about the same for myself, and I don't know if I've got a character who I'll class as my favourite. I know who I would probably draw a spotlight on if I was forced into a corner, but I wouldn't call that person my favourite character by any stretch. But going back to what you just said, as a Christian, I think Joshua was probably the one I admired the most. Again, we're talking violent Old Testament character. What is it about little boys and violence?
Yeah. Well, you're brought up in that, thing too, where like you're serving a God who has the power to destroy everybody. Yeah. So that's kind of like what your ultimate goal is. Like, and people who destroy, well, those are the people you idolize, I guess. So.
Okay, excellent. Thank you again so much, Phil. All the best for your podcast. I do listen to your podcast. So listeners, if you've not heard of Phil's podcast, not listened to it, head over there, give Phil a listen. I enjoy the content that he puts out. I enjoy listening to it. I enjoy intellectually engaging with it while I listen to it. Thank you, Phil, for the work that you and Susie do. I do appreciate it.
All right. Well, thanks again. Yeah. And for Flawed Theology listeners, same goes. If you haven't listened to Still Unbelievable, there's a nice big catalog there that you can go back into history and catch up on and keep following Matt's work. So appreciate it for letting me come on with you, Matt, and talk with you. So
all the best. See you at the launch party for the book. Cheers.
All right.
Phil.
See ya. Bye.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.